Sometimes making a lot of builds is the very thing that causes me to struggle with one. So there's this big group of commander decks that my friends and I are working on, and one of the restrictions is that they each want to be the most possible variety. You know, color identity, you can see on the side, we're not repeating any color identities, and I want one of each of the basic colors, you can see them there. And of all things, I've been struggling with the mono green. Well, we'll come back to this one later, but like, look at these commander options. Plenty of them are good, but that doesn't matter. A decent number are kind of interesting, but almost all of them I couldn't make feel different from the other decks in the group, and also not just a generic pile of green stuff. I couldn't make something refreshing and different that you'd specifically want to play over the other options. I got stuck. And I decided to ask the Magic the Gathering channel on our Discord server. Welcome back, folks. I'm Zandy, and today I want to talk to you about the suggestions that you all put forth in that thread. I've mocked up an example of the deck here, so let's get started. I'll just read you my post first, because of course we've come away since then. Ahoy there, Magic the Gathering channel folks. I'm wrestling with this mono-green commander deck, headed by Kodama of the East Tree and Iktikik Salvage Splicer, which you might imagine I'm struggling to make interesting at all, and not just the generic green pile. I've had the most trouble with mono green out of all the monocolor commander decks I've been working on. Right now I do have a nice range of golems, and the Kodama is pretty solid with tokens because a permanent cost with equal or lesser mana value than a token could be a land. But again, not very far from generic green good stuff and big mana. That's kind of normal tech for Kodama. Any ideas? Well, let's look at these commanders first. So Kodama of the East Tree, as I mentioned before. This is a 6/6 for 6 with reach, and it says whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, not from this ability, you can put a permanent with equal or lesser mana value from your hand onto the battlefield, and it's a partner. So this means that if you play a 5-drop, you can put a permanent that is 5 or less mana into play. Now, lands are permanents with 0 mana value. So if you put a token into play, tokens usually have 0 mana value, but it says equal or lesser, so you can put a land into play. At the very least, this means that you can put out a land with every single permanent you add into play, but a lot of the time it can be a lot more mana than that. And I think this rewards you for playing really big stuff as well as really small stuff, because you can ramp out those lands. You know, it's very, very rare for this ability to not be valuable. In some ways, that's kind of the problem, though we'll get back to that later. It's a partner pairing, and so Iktikik Salvage Splicer is the other commander I picked. The main thing with this guy is you've got a 5-drop, we were just on about that. You get a token as he comes into play. So this is going to allow you to play a lot of permanents out, with Kodama, of course. And the effect, the second effect, says whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put a 1/1 counter on this and a 1/1 counter on each golem you control. A line of play naturally emerges. If you make a bunch of token golems, they all let you put out more lands with Kodama. That lets you play big things with Kodama. And if the golems die, they're artifact creatures. So you get to build up all of your golems. You get a kind of go wide and go tall strategy at the same time, and you get both of the pieces in the command zone. You also get this nice thing where if you want a bunch of value with Kodama, you can always play Iktikik from the command zone and hit kind of the turbo button and play a bunch of stuff out of your hand. If you just put a bunch of card draw and golems in this deck, it's gonna be good, but I just don't think that's that interesting. Obviously, even at this early stage, you can see that I'm pretty over-attached to this commander pairing, but I wanted to see if I could find something unique, and indeed a lot of those other green options. We'll go through a few other candidates later, and as you saw at the beginning, I kind of did make a different decision in the end, but it's not like this is the least common problem for these mono-green commanders. Mono-green is an identity. It can be a little frustrating. You've got a flexible color, but that doesn't mean distinct. You get a color that's good at killing lots of different kinds of permanents, but that's not very distinct. Yeah, it's too balanced. Green is too good. But hey, let's not overcomplicate things. So what were the suggestions that people posted? Scrolling down to the very first thing someone said, it's affinity. Wee-oo, wee-oo, wee-oo. Affinity does not fit my goals, but that's not this poster's fault. Affinity is a perfectly reasonable approach, a little unusual for green, and it is well enabled by these commanders. But as we scroll down a little more, that evolved a little bit. As a way to cheat bigger things for less mana. Is there another way to do that, maybe? Am I entirely crazy, or is Rampage of the Clans something here? Oh, yes it is. Let's take a look at that. This is a 4-mana green instant that destroys all artifacts and enchantments, and for everything destroyed that way, a 3/3 green centaur comes into play. This is, I guess, mass removal for all that kind of stuff. But then I guess the idea is the 3/3 green centaurs benefit you, the Kodamic, let's go with Kodamic player, more than everybody else, because each 3/3 green centaur lets you put into play a land or another 0-cost permanent. And so that benefits you more. I'm not as high on this as the Discord was, but I do think that this is the kind of card that is good in the deck. Iktikik gets all the counters from the golems getting destroyed, and then you get a bunch of 3/3s, so it's not, you're kind of on par there. And then you could just make more golems and pretty quickly build back up. So I don't think this is a bad idea. You could take the deck in a direction where you play Oops All Creatures. There is already an Oops All Creatures deck in the pod, and I think that strategy is weak enough when there are mostly decks that are not with that kind of restriction, that I really want to give that deck all the help it can. So for example, 3 colors. That's gonna make the deck stronger on average, and so I don't want this to be the Oops All Creatures deck. You're sensing a pattern with all these demands for the pod of decks, but anyway, I certainly think this is a good card in the strategy, sure. Where things really get spicy, what are you doing? Maskwood Nexus to make every creature get counters. Make everything a golem. Pick golem. Hell yeah, that's good. Animation module, interesting. And then we start looking into other token producers. I'm not that sure that I think more tokens that have a mana value of 0 is that good of an idea, because already the most likely thing that will happen is that you'll just run out of stuff that you can play off Kodama of the East Tree's ability. But to get more lands into your hand, okay, now we're talking. That's definitely a thing that would be worth doing. Cheap defensive puts a land in your hand. I don't like using shuffling in my decks, but that's not their fault. It's fine to just throw ideas out there. And getting into the deck list proper, you can see that I do have a whole category here of land restocking cards, things that are card draw, or a lot of them make map tokens, we'll get back to it in a minute, or just as was recommended, cards that simply put lands in your hand. You're going to be able to play out basically any amount of lands that you get, so pretty much as strong as you can get cards that will restock your hand with land to be, you will be able to put the land down. There's not really a limit to that, except having good things to play off of them. The hits keep coming. Map tokens? Sure. Topography Tracker, Sentinel of the Nameless City. There aren't that many other good sources of map tokens that are in these colors, but too bad. Mycosynth Golem to give artifacts affinity for artifacts. It's an okay fit, but pretty expensive. Bootlegger's Stash. This one is a little weird. Lands you control let you make a treasure token, so this can let them make mana of any color. You can store your mana, but what they're thinking is you can tap a land to make a 0-cost permanent, and then that lets you put another land into play. Every time you use a land, you can put another land into play. I personally feel like this is so much ability to play out lands that you won't possibly be able to get value out of it. So I actually don't think this is that good in this deck, as you know, it's kind of good in every deck. Just card draw, of course. But then, oh then, a masterpiece enters the equation. For up until this point, the suggestions have been things that work well with Kodama of the East Tree, but not in any way that a deck would ever not work well with this card. It doesn't really do something new with it or exploit it in any way. Those are just things that are good with this card's effect in a straightforward way. Yeah, putting tokens into play aggressively to spam out a bunch of land is like a little bit of its own thing, but it doesn't play to the card's weaknesses in any way. And in particular, you're not really making it any better than just more ramp. And I mean, the card is 6 mana. You know, I could go for a mana dork, really. But the offspring mechanic, oh yes. It says for whatever the offspring cost is, you may pay an additional that much as you cast this spell. If you do, when this creature enters, create a 1/1 token copy of it. So the token copies have, you know, the same mana cost as the main creature. So you get 2 4-cost cards. Conveniently enough, they actually put this on the token. You can see it clarifies that as it is an exact copy of the previous card, its mana cost is 4 at the bottom. This is the mini version for whatever that set was called, Bloomborough, the set with the offspring mechanic, they made token versions of all the offspring cards. So you, yeah, like have one that's like a little baby version, very cute. And it also clarifies it a little more. You know, they're often pretty involved, pretty specific tokens. Exact copies have the mana value of the thing they copied. Aha. So we'll just click on the advanced search, offspring, green color identity, search with these options, and there are only four. And there are only four, and three of them are 2 or 1 mana. Oh no. When I make decks, something that I like to do is to focus on exactly how well the concept for the deck that I'm pursuing is going. Well, I want to do something interesting with Kodama of the East Tree's ability. That seems to mostly not exist, is the pattern I'm seeing. Now, whenever you make a video like this on the internet, of course, someone will come up with something, and I think that's wonderful. I will point out that there is actually some pretty good support for this strategy in just a mundane way. The golems category, for example, there are some very expensive golem and even specifically golem token related cards. That's actually pretty good. I feel like that's the thing that I have the most hope about in this deck. If you want to make this strategy yourself, that's probably the good part, is that the actual golem creatures you play fit the deck's theme incredibly well and are really cheap for what it's worth. The land restocking, you know, that exists, I guess, but it's a very straightforward deck. That's fine, that's not bad, but is there any support for this kind of clever angle I was trying to take? The Discord had some very good ideas, but I don't think there's much else. Actually, for a little bit, let me just walk you through some of the categories, as I did put most of the deck list together. So as I mentioned before, the golem situation is pretty good. There are a good number of high-cost golems that do the thing the deck is doing. They make 3/3 token golems, for example. When it dies or whatever, there's a good amount of small ones, so you'll be able to play out more golems to get Iktikik's passive to kick into gear, you know, the go wide part of the deck. The golem support part is, you know, it's very good. There aren't like that many of them, but there's an okay number of relevant cards, and they are pretty good. Moving over to interaction, the situation is kind of okay because it's a green deck. And in a way, you know, a lot of the interaction is on creatures. It'll either be to destroy a creature, you're going to fight them, or it's like removal for a non-creature permanent of some description that is on a creature. And so these do play well with Kodama of the East Tree. That would be true no matter what direction you took this deck in, but like, yeah, it's good, sure. There's also a lot of reactive green cards that make creature tokens, like Arachnogenesis here. It's kind of a fog. You prevent combat damage, but then it makes a bunch of 1/2 green spiders. The last thing this deck really needs, if you put any amount of effort into abusing Kodama of the East Tree, is the ability to play out more lands, more zero-cost things, but it's not bad. I mean, it's still a good effect. Like, you definitely will always have any lands in your hand on the battlefield. And this is kind of a fine card anyway, so yeah, it's not that this is bad. There are things like that. There's a good amount of stuff in the destroy all artifacts and enchantments category that is like kind of fine, and this deck mostly is okay with that. There's not that many relevant enchantments. The artifacts is kind of okay if they get destroyed. Iktikik provides some board wipe protection plus bonus for destroying your little golems. So while not a perfect fit for this deck, as there are a lot of artifacts in this list, you'll see, especially if I zoom out, it's true that this kind of card, you know, is good. The removal in this deck, though, it doesn't bring joy for me. The situation in the pot of decks in general is that we're trying to make it so every deck is kind of a themed removal engine as well, that the decks have extremely high interaction. We're sort of trying to play CEDH, like competitive commander, but with much lower powered cards, but still the same experience. So tons of interaction, like an ocean of interaction. But one thing you can do to make it so decks don't just combo often in the game, something my playgroup doesn't enjoy as much, is to just make the interaction more expensive, but to make it so the deck has a propensity of it, like a lot of it, but just that it isn't as efficient, basically. isn't as efficient, that's fine. Green passes this test really, really well. There's lots of like big green things and small green things and little fight spells that will be good in this deck, repeatable removal and stuff like that. But none of it has anything to do with the strategy. It's just cards that really every green deck in the pod kind of wants to run and basically is running, you know, those effects. So interaction good, golem based on theme interaction, eh. We'll go to land restocking, which we kind of talked about before, but yeah, I mean, it's okay. You know, there's card draw in green when you have lots of creatures coming into play, like it's good. There's a good amount of effects in green that say whenever a creature with power 3 or 4 or greater or whatever comes into play, you draw a card, and the golems are 3/3s, so that's very strong in this strategy. There's a good amount of them that are 4 or greater, unfortunately, but with one counter on the golems from Iktikik's ability, you'll hit that. So a lot of these effects are very strong. You could put way more in. Since I don't plan to actually play this deck, I just didn't bother, but you could put like 10 of those effects in this deck and probably ought to, though you're approaching danger of drawing the entire deck out. Permanents with benefits. Will you remember Rust Shield Rampager? This is good in here. You pay 6 mana and you get 2 4-cost permanents into play. It's good. That's not amazing, unfortunately. Abusing Kodama's ability more than just pooping out a bunch of lands by actually putting permanents into play is hard. That you don't actually save that much mana by doing it like this. But at the very least, you do get 2, 3 or lower cost things. That's good. I definitely think this card is good in this deck, but only at a medium power level. So I made a category that's just cards that are relevant to the strategy. They'll put a lot of stuff into play, and some of them put in copies of things, copies of an exact card, and therefore it will have the card's mana cost. Myriad, which makes a copy, an attacking copy of whatever creature has it, attacking each opponent. So that's very strong here. Bloodforge Battle Axe is only 1 mana, but what are you going to do? Brass Knuckles, you get a copy of it. So you get 2 things that are 4 cost. Things like this. I'm a little shaky on the corner case rule we're abusing here, where tokens that are an exact copy of a card have the card's mana cost, but a lot of these will work. There are a lot of things that take the principle suggested by the Discord that, you can get a copy that has a mana cost higher than 0 and run with it. There are cards that are a lot better than this that do that. But not very many at all. Many of these just make normal tokens or have myriad. Like, that's pretty much it. And a lot of them are still not that good. A lot of them are giving you, a lot of copies of a 3 mana trigger, but that only lets you put 2, 1, and 0 cost things into play. So it's just not clear that you're going to get that much value. In the first place, whenever you use Kodama of the East Tree's effect to cheat something into play, if it's not something big, you're fundamentally only playing one other card out, not saving you very much mana. So if you just cheated out a land, you could have just tapped the land to play the card. For example, cheating out Rancor instead of cheating out a land, it's like you could just cheat the land out and then cast the Rancor. So once the token you're making is smaller than a certain size, it doesn't really do anything to cheat it into play. If anything, this just sours me to Kodama of the East Tree. Without getting into the rest of the deck, suffice to say, it's a strategy that you can play. If this seems fun to you, there's no ridicule for me. Like, I think it's fun, and that's why I decided to mock it up and look at it. But I don't think this strategy is exciting compared to the stuff that is in the pod otherwise. We've got Glarb Umori with the Secret Commander and all creatures in the deck. We've got 20 copies of Chandra Planeswalker with Leori to protect and power them up. We've got using enchantments with a Reanimator Shell to get double use out of the enchantment removal. We've got Tarmogoyf with a bunch of removal in Jund color. I don't know, they're not all winners, okay. But even still, I think this deck nails what it's setting out to do a lot more than that other deck was. The idea of restricting everyone's hand size, that's pretty much what Winter Misanthropic Guide does. And then using Tarmogoyfs to play really big creatures for an efficient mana value, while having a lot of burst mana, which is good in these colors, mostly red, but there's some in black, like Dark Ritual, and a little bit in green, surprisingly. Wall of Roots should be in here too. does allow you to kind of get ahead a little bit while playing scrappy creatures that are often a little outclassed than Commander. Playing a 4/5 for 2 mana is like fine, but if you can burst out that kind of stuff more than everyone else, you can get into a kind of mud fight that isn't normally possible. And the multi-target removal is just ridiculous in these colors. There's so many cards that are like, destroy 5 permanents, you know? But I hope that you can also learn from my mistakes. It's pretty clear that the reason I was having trouble with that deck before is that I was overly insistent on it matching a theme. Why does it need to be a same color partner pair? Why can't I just play a single commander? There is another partner deck in the pod already. Is it really that unique to have a single color partner pair? I don't think so. It might then surprise you that the commander that we settled on was Finn the Fangbearer, and this is somewhat of a topic for another time, but poison wasn't in the pod otherwise. And a big problem with poison is I think that this can easily be a very unfun strategy to play against in Commander, but it's a great fit for this pod because we're limiting the power value of the decks together, and they're not for any one person. We could just restrict the amount of proliferate that you have access to, and then it's fine. And having an aggro deck, there's one other aggro deck in the pod. It's in white and red, and it's doing something very different. It's kind of a stacks type of taxing focused, smokestacky aggro deck. Pretty interesting in its own right. But an aggro deck that's trying to beat people up and get them killed early with poison. It sounds cool, and a lot of the new poison cards have toxic, which makes the creature do normal damage and they get a little bit of poison. So it plays a lot better in a pod with a lot of other decks, because when you hurt an opponent, they don't only take poison counters, they are still at risk of other players dying to them. In normal one-on-one Magic, this is not a very big deal and kind of inelegant, but in multiplayer, I actually think that plays really well, and the support for this strategy is pretty good. Alongside a bit of a flip side for green, which is that this strategy is low to the ground. Like, it's not that heavy on bombs. Very unusual for green, which I think is kind of novel. We have plenty of green ramp in the pod. Everyone has played plenty of green ramping. So it is a novel experience, and I wanted a Death Touch focused strategy. I think Death Touch is a great ability for green's fight mechanics, and giving mono green, where your only option for creature removal basically is the fight stuff, the Death Touch focused deck, I think is a really elegant way, you see what I mean, to integrate removal into the strategy. So far, this has been shaping up to look pretty good, but we haven't played it yet, so I guess I'll report back. There were a lot of other good comments that actually just reinforced my idea that this wasn't the deck I was looking for, the Kodamic strategy, but I wanted to read them because I thought they were interesting echoes of the experience I'd had. I actually started brewing a very similar deck very recently, except it was Ictakick and Slurg all ingesting. Indeed, I had really overlooked that there are a lot of partners that are relevant to the strategy that are just more interesting. If I had insisted on a monocolor partner deck, yeah, like there are other options I could have taken. Kodama of the East Tree was somewhat of the problem, and I could easily see a more Ictakick focused strategy that just goes in a different direction being interesting. I did give it up, they continue, due to being a generic green pile. I think that's kind of unavoidable if your commanders are both expensive. That's a good point, and it's interesting to see how the way I found to avoid it, while I didn't get there by thinking, oh, maybe it's because the commander is really pricey, it ended up getting me to the same place. I thought that was interesting to see. And then scrolling down a bit, somebody else suggested food synergy. Food shores up a slow start with life gain, counts for Ictakick to bump up the golems because the foods are artifacts that get sacrificed. Treasure would also be interesting, and can enable affinity cheese options. Options like Trail of Crumbs and Bristleblood Farmer seem good. Yeah. There are limited affinity options, but still, food does a lot. Sure, I think that's really intelligent. I just wanted to respond to these briefly because they're really well thought through ideas that helped me, but I just didn't have another way to weave them into the video, and it's interesting to see how the path I took kind of traced similar ideas. I do think the food is an interesting one. That does elegantly kind of shore up the strategy a little bit, but yeah, I think if you were to build an Ictakick thing, I'd want to lean more into the sacrificing artifacts angle, maybe with treasure tokens. In any case, it was a fun journey, and I wanted to take you along with me for a little trace of the path that our mindset followed, me and the Discord. So thank you folks on Discord for chiming in. It was really helpful and interesting and made me have more fun digging around for green strategies. I will give credit where credit's due that my friend actually recommended I ask all of you, why are you being so shy about asking for advice in the community you set up to do this? So that was very nice. Thank you. And thank you to all my patrons and other supporters for funding this video. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you in the next one.